My name is Sarah. I am 42 years old, and the bitter chill of the Seattle wind was biting through my thin winter coat as I clutched the paper bag holding my last meal until payday. It was a rustic loaf of sourdough bread, warm and comforting, bought with the very last crumpled bills scraped from my worn purse. The city streets were slick with freezing rain, reflecting the harsh neon lights of the closed storefronts around me. I was exhausted, my boots soaked through, wanting nothing more than to get back to the small apartment I rented. That was exactly when I saw him. Huddled in a dark alleyway, wrapped tightly in layers of filthy, soaked cardboard, a frail homeless man was shivering violently against the unforgiving concrete. He extended a trembling, dirt-caked hand toward me, his voice a broken, desperate rasp begging for anything to eat. Without a second thought, my heart aching deeply at the sight of such raw human misery, I reached into my bag, pulled out that warm loaf, and placed it gently into his cold palms. He looked up, the dim, amber glow of the street lamp catching the deep, tragic lines of his weathered face. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The entire world around me stopped completely. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape. Underneath the thick grime, the matted gray hair, and the hollowed, starving cheeks, I recognized those piercing, unforgettable, icy blue eyes instantly. It was Richard, the ruthless corporate CEO who had brutally fired me 10 years ago, destroying my entire life and career in a matter of seconds. And as the horrifying recognition slowly dawned in his terrified eyes too, a chilling, suffocating silence fell between us. To truly understand the paralyzing shock of that frozen moment, I have to take you back to a time when my reality was entirely different. 10 years ago, I was a fiercely ambitious woman working at a prestigious marketing firm in downtown Seattle. I poured my absolute soul into that massive glass building, working late into the night, sacrificing my weekends and personal relationships just to prove my worth. Richard was the chief executive officer at the time, a terrifyingly powerful man of 55 years old, whose mere physical presence commanded absolute authority and instilled a deep fear in every employee. He was impeccably sharp, always dressed in custom-tailored suits, and possessed a calculating demeanor that made you feel completely invisible unless you were making him richer. I respected his business acumen, perhaps even feared his wrath, but I foolishly believed my relentless hard work would earn his approval. I wanted to succeed desperately because I was carrying the heavy burden of massive student loan debt and helping my aging parents cover their medical bills. I viewed that high-pressure job as my sole ticket to financial freedom, entirely blind to the toxic reality of the corporate machine. The breaking point arrived on what started as the proudest day of my professional life. After 6 months of grueling labor, I had finally closed the biggest advertising account in the history of our firm, a deal guaranteeing tens of millions in revenue. I was naive enough to believe this was my breakthrough, the pivotal moment my dedication would be rewarded with a senior promotion. I walked into the office feeling profound pride, completely unaware that the ground was about to be ripped out from underneath me. The sudden summons to Richard's top-floor corner office came just before lunch. I remember the sharp sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, my stomach fluttering with nervous hope. When I walked through those heavy doors, Richard did not even look up from his mahogany desk. He let me stand there in agonizing silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a sigh of annoyance, he slid a single thin piece of white paper across the table. It was a formal termination notice, effective immediately. My mind went blank. I tried to speak to ask what was happening, but my voice completely failed me. He finally looked up at me with those icy blue eyes, completely devoid of human empathy, and coldly stated that my position was being permanently eliminated due to corporate restructuring. He delivered the news with the cruel indifference of someone brushing lint off their jacket. I would later discover the horrifying truth. He had maliciously taken full personal credit for my multi-million-dollar account to secure an astronomical year-end bonus for himself, discarding me to ensure there were absolutely no loose ends. I panicked. I literally stood in that lavish office and openly pleaded with him, abandoning my professional dignity. I frantically explained that I had no financial safety net, that my rent was severely overdue, and that I had sacrificed my youth for his company. Richard did not offer a shred of sympathy. Instead, he simply pressed a button on his intercom, called security, and had me forcefully escorted out of the lobby like a common criminal in full view of my colleagues. The sheer public humiliation of that moment was a visceral pain, a burning sensation in my chest that made it entirely impossible to draw a full breath. The immediate aftermath of that devastating day was a rapid descent into a dark nightmare from which I could not wake up. Within 2 agonizing months, I had depleted the meager funds in my checking account. I desperately tried to find another job, but I quickly realized that Richard, wielding his immense industry influence, had quietly blacklisted me. He had spread vicious rumors that I was fired for gross incompetence. I was locked out of the only career I knew. The absolute lowest point arrived on a freezing Tuesday morning when I officially lost my apartment. I remember standing numbly on the wet concrete curb, watching as the landlord changed the brass locks. I was sitting beside 2 battered suitcases containing the entirety of my worldly possessions, sobbing uncontrollably until there were no tears left to cry. That was the exact moment my best friend, Jessica, a 43-year-old emergency room nurse with a heart of gold, miraculously found me. She drove up in her rusted sedan, took one heartbroken look at my broken state, and packed my suitcases into her trunk without asking a single probing question. Jessica generously let me sleep on her lumpy living room couch for 8 agonizing months. Despite her endless kindness, I felt like a massive burden, a complete and utter failure. Every night, I would lie awake in the dark, listening to the rhythmic hum of her old refrigerator, entirely consumed by a toxic mixture of despair and burning hatred for Richard. I hated him with a fiery passion for violently taking my dignity and my livelihood. The anger was a heavy lead blanket that I wore on my shoulders every single day. Over the next few grueling years, the arduous journey to rebuild my shattered life was excruciatingly slow and filled with countless humiliating setbacks. I entirely abandoned my corporate ambitions, the deep trauma of that brutal betrayal still too fresh to even consider returning to an office. Instead, I swallowed my remaining pride and took an exhausting job as a waitress at a noisy downtown diner. I worked agonizing double shifts until the soles of my feet blistered and bled, and my lower back ached with a dull, constant throb. The sheer physical exhaustion was actually a welcome distraction from the mental anguish. Jessica remained my steadfast anchor during those incredibly dark times. She would patiently sit with me at her small kitchen table late at night, brewing cheap chamomile tea, endlessly listening to my frustrated rants. "You are so much stronger than what that monster did to you, Sarah," Jessica would say softly, her voice firm and full of genuine love. "Do not let his profound cruelty turn you into a bitter person. If you let the hatred consume you, he wins." But following her wise advice was incredibly hard. Every single time I had to meticulously count copper pennies at the grocery store just to afford a carton of eggs, every time I had to decline an invitation to dinner with friends because I could not afford a basic meal, the fiery resentment toward Richard flared up in my chest. I spent hours vividly imagining him in his luxurious penthouse, casually sipping expensive wine, entirely oblivious to the shattered human wreckage he had left in his wake. I desperately wanted justice. Sometimes, in my absolute darkest moments, I deeply wanted violent revenge. I wanted him to feel the exact same terrifying helplessness. Let us fast forward through the years of grueling recovery to the present day. Through sheer stubborn willpower and countless sacrifices, I had finally managed to secure a modest administrative job at a small community medical clinic. The financial pay was certainly not glamorous, but the environment was incredibly supportive, and importantly, it allowed me to finally rent a tiny, drafty, but private studio apartment entirely of my own. I was deeply, fiercely proud of my hard-won independence. I was proud of the quiet resilience I had painfully forged in the absolute hottest fires of my struggle. However, life has a cruel way of aggressively testing you just when you mistakenly think you have found your solid footing. A sudden, severe dental emergency earlier this very month had completely wiped out my carefully guarded emergency fund and brutally eaten into my essential grocery budget. The blinding pain in my jaw had been entirely unbearable, requiring an immediate root canal that my low-tier health insurance barely covered. I had to empty every single account I had just to stop the blinding physical pain. That terrifying financial blow is exactly how I found myself walking home on this utterly miserable, freezing Friday evening with exactly $3.42 to my name, desperately praying for my next tiny paycheck to clear the following Monday morning. The biting cold was seeping through my worn shoes, but my gnawing hunger was a much more pressing concern. I had intentionally walked past a small, brightly lit bakery, the heavenly scent of fresh yeast and warm butter drawing me in like an irresistible magnet. Knowing it was my only option, I spent my very last crumpled bills and heavy coins on a large, rustic loaf of plain sourdough bread. It was officially supposed to be my meager breakfast, my sad lunch, and my lonely dinner for the next 3 agonizing days. It was quite literally my strict survival ration, the only barrier between me and total starvation for the long weekend. As I stepped heavily out of the warm bakery and back into the unforgiving night, the brutal Seattle weather seemed to intentionally mock my incredibly fragile, precarious situation. The steady rain abruptly turned into a stinging sleet. The icy droplets relentlessly pelted my numb face and quickly soaked right through my thin wool scarf. I carefully tucked the warm paper bag deep inside my winter coat, pressing it firmly against my chest to preserve its fading heat and protect the essential food from the relentless moisture. The dark city streets were mostly empty, the sensible citizens having long since sought comfortable refuge in their warm homes. I kept my head bowed low, fiercely focusing on simply placing one freezing foot in front of the other, battling the bitter, howling wind. I was silently calculating the exact number of thin slices I could get from the heavy bread, planning how to stretch it with the half-empty jar of peanut butter in my cabinet. My exhausted mind was so entirely preoccupied with my own desperate survival mechanics that I completely failed to notice my surroundings. I almost tripped entirely over a massive, sodden pile of ruined cardboard aggressively blocking the dark entrance to a narrow, unlit alleyway. I gasped sharply, stumbling backward awkwardly, my racing heart immediately leaping into my tight throat out of pure fear. The dark pile suddenly shifted, a low, wretched, utterly heartbreaking moan escaping from deep beneath the foul layers of discarded newspapers and rotting trash bags. I completely froze in place, my ingrained city instincts loudly screaming at me to just keep walking, to completely ignore the dangerous situation and selfishly protect myself. But the pitiful moan came once again, significantly weaker this time, a sound of such profound, agonizing human defeat that it entirely bypassed my carefully constructed city armor and struck directly at my vulnerable core. Against all logic, I cautiously took a slow step closer, peering deeply into the gloomy shadows. A frail man was tightly curled into a tiny shivering ball on the freezing wet concrete. His ruined clothes were little more than filthy rags, completely saturated with the freezing slush. He had absolutely no shoes, his freezing bare feet wrapped pathetically in torn plastic grocery bags. When he slowly lifted his heavy head, the sheer desperation rolling off him was palpable. He did not ask for spare money. He just stared intensely at the faint outline of my bakery bag.
"Please, I am so terribly hungry. I genuinely cannot remember the very last time I ate a meal," he whispered. The voice was incredibly raspy, severely broken by the brutal cold and prolonged silence, but there was a strange, haunting familiarity in the specific cadence of his desperate words that I could not quite place. My internal emotional struggle was fiercely violent and entirely immediate. The warm bread pressed against my chest suddenly felt incredibly heavy. It was my absolutely only source of food. If I foolishly gave it away to a stranger, I would personally face genuine, agonizing hunger for the entire weekend. I selfishly thought about the sharp emptiness already growing in my own stomach. But then I looked deeply into the broken man's sunken eyes. They were completely surrounded by dark, bruised flesh, perfectly reflecting a level of profound suffering that I knew all too intimately. I vividly remembered the terrifying, lonely nights crying on Jessica's couch, the paralyzing uncertainty of survival. A profound wave of deep empathy suddenly washed completely over me, entirely drowning out my own fierce self-preservation instincts.
I slowly unzipped my coat, my stiff fingers incredibly clumsy from the freezing cold. I pulled out the crinkled paper bag. The incredible warm scent of the fresh sourdough instantly filled the frigid air between us. I slowly knelt down right on the filthy wet pavement, completely ignoring the icy slush rapidly seeping through my jeans, and held the large bread out to him. "Here," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Take it, all of it." He reached out with frail hands that were shaking so incredibly violently, he almost dropped the heavy loaf into the mud. His cracked fingernails were badly broken and deeply caked with dark grime. He tore aggressively into the thick crust with a frantic, animalistic desperation, aggressively stuffing the soft bread into his mouth, as if he genuinely feared it would instantly vanish into thin air. I watched him eat, a strange mixture of profound relief and deep sorrow swelling in my tight chest. And then he abruptly paused. He swallowed hard, coughing slightly, and slowly looked up to properly thank me. The dim, flickering amber glow of the street lamp illuminated his face completely. The thick dirt, the wild beard, and the deep wrinkles of severe premature aging could not possibly hide the fundamental bone structure. They could not hide the distinct shape of his strong jaw, or the sharp, arrogant arch of his eyebrows. But mostly, they absolutely could not hide the piercing, unforgettable, terrifying shade of his icy blue eyes. Time entirely stopped. The loud ambient noise of the city traffic, the relentless drumming of the freezing rain, the howling wind, everything violently faded into absolute deafening silence. I was no longer a struggling 42-year-old woman kneeling in a filthy alleyway. I was 32 again, standing terrified in that massive mahogany office, feeling my entire world violently collapse around me. Richard. The name slipped from my shocked lips before my frozen brain could even begin to process the impossible reality of the situation. It was barely a breath, carried away by the wind, but he heard it perfectly. The frantic chewing stopped instantly. The piece of bread in his trembling hand fell heavily to the wet cardboard. His blue eyes widened, a flash of pure terror crossing his features. He stared at me, his terrified gaze darting frantically across my face, desperately searching his broken memory for the source of recognition. I saw the exact devastating moment the realization violently hit him. The color completely and instantly drained from his filthy face. His jaw trembled, not from the freezing cold this time, but from a profound, paralyzing shock. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice cracking violently. The way he said my name was not with the cold authority of a powerful CEO, but with the fragile tone of a completely broken man encountering a vengeful ghost from a past life. I stood up slowly, my legs suddenly feeling like incredibly heavy lead. A chaotic storm of intense emotions erupted violently inside my chest. Deep shock, absolute disbelief, burning anger, sweet vindication, and a bizarre sense of profound pity all fought viciously for total dominance. For several long, agonizing minutes, neither of us moved a single muscle. We were entirely frozen in a bizarre, tragic tableau, a twisted reunion perfectly orchestrated by the cruel irony of fate. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. This was the man who ruined me. This was the very monster who had brutally tossed me onto the street just to line his own pockets. I had spent countless nights vividly fantasizing about this exact moment. I had imagined furiously confronting him, screaming at him, joyfully watching him lose absolutely everything. And now, here he was. He had lost everything. He was sitting pathetically in a puddle of freezing slush, wearing literal garbage, desperately eating my leftover survival bread. The universe had finally delivered the ultimate justice. A dark part of my soul wanted to violently kick the bread away and scream that he deserved this misery. How? The harsh word violently tore from my tight throat. It was the only question that mattered. Richard violently flinched at the sharpness of my angry tone. He pulled his thin, filthy knees tightly to his chest. "Pride?" he whispered brokenly, a single tear carving a clean line through the thick dirt on his cheek. "Greed? I truly believed I was entirely invincible, Sarah." His voice was incredibly weak. He explained how his relentless pursuit of wealth led him to engage in massive illegal corporate fraud.
The federal government caught on rapidly. The investigation was swift and completely brutal. They completely froze all my massive assets, seized my luxurious properties, and my expensive lawyers bled me entirely dry, keeping me out of federal prison, he confessed, shivering violently. The massive fines completely bankrupted him in a matter of months. My family, he sobbed, his face twisting in genuine horrific agony. They left the exact moment the money stopped. My wife filed for divorce and moved away with the kids. They completely refused to speak to me. I am entirely, completely alone in this world. The sheer magnitude of his spectacular fall was entirely staggering. As I stood there in the freezing rain, listening to the pathetic whimpers of the man who had once destroyed my life with a single pen stroke, I patiently waited for the glorious feeling of vindication. But it never came. Instead, an unexpected, incredibly heavy sadness settled deep in my soul. I did not see an evil mastermind anymore. I just saw a starving, freezing, broken old man rapidly approaching the end of his tragic life.
The toxic hatred suddenly felt incredibly heavy, a burden I no longer wanted to carry. I remembered Jessica's words, "Do not let his cruelty turn you into a bitter person." I slowly reached out and placed my hand gently on his trembling shoulder. "What you did to me was absolutely unforgivable," I said, my voice incredibly steady. "You broke me, but I survived, and I am not going to let you die in this freezing alley." I pulled out my phone, called a local emergency shelter I knew well, and secured him a warm intake bed. "Why?" he choked out, crying violently. "Why are you helping me? I ruined your life." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of peace. "Because I choose to be better than the darkness you brought into my life," I replied firmly. "I am choosing forgiveness for my own absolute freedom." I helped him up, gave him the rest of the bread, draped my winter coat over his shivering shoulders, and slowly walked him through the freezing rain to the brightly lit doors of the shelter. I watched him go inside, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. I turned around and walked back out into the cold. The profound, life-altering lesson I truly learned on that freezing night is that ultimate power does not ever reside in a corporate corner office, a massive bank account, or the terrifying ability to destroy others. True, absolute power is the conscious, incredibly difficult choice to offer mercy when every single fiber of your being screams for revenge. Giving my very last piece of bread to the cruel man who ruined my life did not fix his past mistakes, nor did it magically fill my painfully empty bank account, but it completely and permanently healed the festering toxic wound in my own soul. It undeniably proved to me that my core humanity was entirely unbreakable. I consciously chose to rewrite the tragic ending of our story, beautifully transforming a narrative of bitter, dark trauma into a powerful testament of profound, lasting redemption. Now, as I look back on that incredible, impossible encounter in the alleyway, I often wonder about the true boundaries of human forgiveness and the choices we make in our absolute darkest moments. If you were in my exact place, staring at the person who broke you, would you do the same? The cold rain continued to fall as I walked the rest of the way to my tiny apartment, my stomach growling with hunger, but my heart was overflowing with an inexplicable warmth that no amount of money could ever buy. Until the next story.